morning, Dr. Arenberg. Thank you for joining us. Tell me, how does a retired ear surgeon relate to the history of Vincent van Gogh?
Well, about 30 years ago, I corrected the misdiagnosis that Vincent had epilepsy. That was the underlying basis for the attacks that he was known to have. These attacks were actually an inner ear vertigo that's called Meniere's disease. And this article I wrote was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association on the 100th anniversary of his death.
So, Dr. Arenberg, most people believe that Vincent van Gogh committed suicide. Do you agree with that?
No. I never believed that Vincent committed suicide since I saw the movie Lust for Life when I was a teenager. But I never really did much with it till I did all this research for the epilepsy versus Meniere's disease article. But then I didn't do much with it. Now I have shown forensically that it was not possible for Vincent to commit suicide. I did reenactments and simulations using the same weapon that was allegedly used to shoot him with black powder bullets, and showed that it was not physically or forensically likely for him to do that. If Vincent didn't put the hole in his belly himself, whoever put that hole in his belly murdered him. So Vincent didn't commit suicide, he was murdered.
So what contributions have you made to medicine?
Well, I've had a long career, and over that time frame I've received several major awards. I got the highest award from NIH to an individual.
What is NIH?
National Institute of Health. I've also received 3 gold medals, one from the University of Bologna, the oldest medical school in Europe, another one from the Chinese ENT Society in the Republic of China, and the last one was from the Prosper Meniere Society for Lifetime Achievement. I've also had a lot of patents, and I've written hundreds of peer-reviewed articles. I was an editorial board of 7 journals. So I've had a very nice medical career, and now I'm retired, and I've been working on Vincent.
So, Dr. Arenberg, tell us about your new book.
The new book is Love and Murder, The Final Days of Vincent van Gogh. And I'm writing that to try to answer the questions that are left hanging once you understand that Vincent didn't commit suicide. Once you've accepted the forensic studies and can't disprove it, you have to realize that whoever put the hole in Vincent's belly murdered him. So the real focus of the new book is to determine who all the suspicious characters are, the persons of interest, and the motivation that would lead anybody to murder Vincent van Gogh when at that time he was an unknown artist. Why did anybody want to murder him?
What's missing from this book that would get closure to the 130-year-old cold case?
Well, one of the key things that's missing is the bullet. We don't know that he was actually shot because there was no bullet. There was no gun, there was no witness, no gunshot, and there was an exit wound. There was no exit wound. So without an exit wound, the bullet should still be in Vincent's remains. So what we'd really like to do to actually bring this to full closure is to do a respectful exhumation and autopsy of Vincent to see if there's any secrets that he took to his grave that might answer the question you've asked.
So, if Vincent didn't commit suicide and he was murdered, then who did it and why?
That's a good question. Vincent didn't commit suicide, he was murdered. And the reason he was murdered was a hidden romance and love affair between Vincent and Marguerite Clementine Gachet, the doctor's daughter. When that was uncovered, and the doctor got very upset because Vincent and Marguerite wanted to marry, and that was known because her best friend relayed that information to an investigative reporter years later. So it was known that Vincent and Marguerite were lovers, and the when this was fully revealed to the father and his son, they decided they didn't want Vincent part of their family. The revealing factor, the critical information, was that in 3 days in a row, at the end of June, literally a month before Vincent was murdered, he painted 3 portraits of a so-called peasant girl. When you look at his prior paintings, these 3 paintings were classic portraits. They weren't a peasant girl. They were wearing fine dresses, neck things, earrings, a hat with ribbons. They were not peasant girls. And when it was revealed that the person sitting for these portraits was Marguerite, the father and son got very upset, and they had a huge rift, and they heard arguments coming out of the Gachet home. And on the day that Vincent was murdered, a later interviewer has placed the father, the son, and Marguerite and Vincent all at their home the morning of the day he was murdered. So those 3 portraits, when they were unmasked, was the trigger, the catalyst to cause the family to want to kill Vincent, and they did.
That's all exciting and new information. How important is it for you to find the bullet?
Well, the bullet is actually critical to determine whether or not a gun was used to kill Vincent or a knife. If there was only a very small pea-sized entry wound with color around it but no black powder burn, then you can't prove that a bullet was used in a gun to kill him unless you have a bullet in his remains. So in the absence of a bullet being found at the autopsy, the knife theory that could have made a small puncture hole that looked just like a bullet entry hole is just as valid. Until you have in hand, in the crime scene investigator's evidence bag, the bullet from Vincent's remains, you can't convince anybody that he was shot with a gun. If we had the bullet, you would also be able to tell what caliber it was. The alleged weapon was a 7mm. There was also supposed to be a .308 revolver used, according to the Secretons, one of the teenagers who was alleged to have been the shooter, accidentally, to kill Vincent. And we still don't know what weapon for sure Dr. Gachet had. He had his service weapon from being in the military as a doctor during the Franco-Prussian War. And so there's several possibilities. So in addition to proving that he was shot as opposed to knifed, the bullet would answer that question. The bullet could also tell us what caliber it was, which would point to one of the 3 possible guns we know were around at the time. This is all dependent on the forensics, and unless someone can disprove the forensic article that's in the peer-reviewed journal by a very famous forensic pathologist, the suicide theory is basically finished. So all I'm trying to do, and all I've been trying to do, is take all these years of research and find all the dots and try to connect them to determine if Vincent didn't commit suicide and he was murdered, what's the likely scenario, the most likely scenario that would connect all the dots in the best possible way to answer, this is how Vincent died, this is who murdered him. So by doing all this and connecting all the dots, I think I'm able to finally exonerate Vincent from the stigma of suicide, and that's why he wasn't buried in sacred ground at the church, and also to exonerate him from the stigma of a crime, because in 1890 France it was a crime to commit suicide. Had he lived, he would have gone to prison. So Vincent can now rest in peace.